You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Welcome and enjoy.
I'm Michael Halcomb, and in this episode, I'm joined by Fred Long. Fred, how's it?
Hey, doing well. We got a little cold front here in Kentucky, but it's middle of the summer and it's in the 60s, so it feels a little bit weird. Low humidity. Can't complain though. We're getting enough rain. How about you?
Yeah, doing all right. Got a little bit of a windy day here in Hawaii, which is why I'm not recording where I usually am. Hopefully it'll be a little quieter here where I'm recording. But
do you have the big waves happening right now?
Not really. No, it's pretty average summertime waves. We get our big waves in the winter here.
Okay.
So yeah, average size waves, and I got a little spot that I love going to. I've been going to the last, I don't know, about once a week for the last month. It's like those wave pools they have at like a water park or something.
Yeah,
that like make the waves. Well, there's like a cove kind of like hidden between some cliffs here, and it's like a natural wave pool all the time, and it's awesome. I mean, jump off the rocks into this wave pool, and it's always going. Like, you don't have to wait for somebody to turn it on and off, right? It's always going, and that's
great.
My favorite place to go on the island as far as like beaches. But and then we went to took the kids to a cliff jumping last weekend, and then a different place to go jumping, and then there's this other place that's nearby called the Toilet Bowl, and it's a sea cave, and so it's really cool. It forms like a horseshoe, and you jump off in this one place. You jump down into the cave, and when you jump in, the cave will fill back up with water, and just enough for your head to like be above, like, and breathing, and then it'll kind of like empty out, and you can either swim out to the ocean, or if you swim back to where you jumped off, you wait for it to fill back up, and the water fills up so much that it'll just lift you right back up onto the ledge, and then you like,
oh my gosh.
So it's like a toilet bowl, and it empties.
Sounds terrifying.
It's fun. It's an absolute blast. So love doing that.
Man.
Yeah.
Well, you just celebrated 20 years of marriage too. Congratulations on that.
Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate that, man.
Yeah.
I got a great wife, and so grateful for her. And so we're doing well, and just went to Italy. And of course, if you've been listening to the podcast, listeners, you've been hearing episodes about some of the biblical stuff I've seen in Italy. So but today we're back at Galatians. We're in Galatians 4, and we're actually going to wrap up Galatians today. Galatians 4 anyways, not Galatians, but Galatians 4. And so let's jump to that. Let's get to it. I'm going to share on the screen here. I'm using stepbible.org for those of you who might be curious. And we're at verse 30, and then 31 is what we're going to do in this episode. So I will go ahead and read here in the Greek, and then maybe make a couple pronunciation points, and then we'll dive into the meat of the verse. So here we go. We have alati lei egraphe. It's got an interrogative there. Ekvale ten pedisken ke ton wion avtes, ugar me kleronomesi, oios tes pediskes metatu wiutes eleftheras. Just real quickly, something I notice about pronunciation, we have the wios term used 3 times. Is it 3 times here, or just 2? Yeah, 3. And we have it here, wion avtes, wios tes, and then wios tes, and wiutes. So you notice that upsilon iota vowel pair There's two kind of ways you can do this in terms of pronunciation. You can treat it like a W-E in English, like we. That's kind of how I was reading it here. Weonavtes or weostes, weutes. Or you can, it's a little more challenging, but you can do ui and almost treat that iota as if it has like a diathesis above it, where you're saying both letters pretty almost clearly on their own, right? So ue, ue, and when you do that upsilon that way, it's like that French u, e, ue. But it's easier just to say weon, right? Or weos, wiu. And so that we works very, very easily and very well when we're doing the upsilon iota vowel pair, just treating it like a we. Yeah, so that's one of the things. And then just remembering that when we have an epsilon upsilon vowel pair, that's different. It makes an ev sound. So we get eleftheras. Eleftheras. So with the omicron upsilon, you get u. With the epsilon upsilon, you get ev. And with the upsilon iota, you get we. So it's really important to know the vowel pair combinations and how they sound when we're reading Koine. Yep.
Great. Well,
So,
looking at,
yeah, go ahead.
should we go ahead and translate verse 30 then? But what does the scripture say?
Mm-hmm.
Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman will not ever inherit with the son of the free woman. So that's how I would translate that, although I'm wondering about the gar statement. So a couple interesting things here. The verse 30 begins with an Allah. Allah is a corrective statement. Typically, it follows an u or a may statement. Those are negative adverbs. So not this, but this. Now, what's interesting about the verse 30 is that there's not a corresponding negative statement in verse 29. Moreover, verse
Which
29
also begins with Allah.
And does not
28.
follow. Does not follow a negative statement. So this is very unusual. So Allah marks correction, but typically after an u or may, not this, but this. So what's happening in verse 29 and 30? What is being corrected? I think we have to imply that from the context. Now, I was just thinking, just briefly looking at this before we began, whether, my take on 421 and following is that Paul begins a refutatio, a formal refutation section in a speech. We've seen a transition where Paul mentions that there are some who are trying to cut the Galatians out. We've looked at that before back in verse 16, 4:16. And then in 4:21, he calls out people. It says, "Speak to me, those who want to come under the law. Don't you hear the law?" So it seems like Paul is refuting people who are cutting out the Galatians, or some of the Galatians, or maybe some of these agitators. He's calling them out and saying, hey, listen to the law. Listen to the law. So if this is the context, that 421 is this refutation, then it might be that these kind of suspended Allahs, these maybe absolute Allahs that don't have a corresponding previous may or u statement, maybe the correction is coming from this context of refutation, is that these are corrective statements, and that he's making in verse 29 and 30, corrective within the rhetorical situation that is happening in these verses. So anyway, that's just a really interesting thing to consider, the function of these Allahs, how they're not typically functioning. And so we have to kind of wonder, what is it that that Paul is correcting here? And maybe it's the general situation. Because, I mean, I guess he says, he began 421, don't you hear what the law says? And then in verse 30 here, he says, what does the scripture say? And in fact, the scripture says, cast them out. Cast out those who are enslaved and who have this the son that is not supposed to inherit with the son of the free woman.
Do you know what verse? Yeah. What verse is he citing here?
Oh, let me see. He is citing.
Genesis 21:10.
Genesis 21:10 and 12. Yeah.
And is he
drive out the maid and her son, so the son of this maid should not be heir with my son Isaac. Yeah.
Okay. So he's not quoting it word for word. He's just
oh yeah, no. Yeah, he's adapted it.
Yeah.
And that's, if we're really going to do some detailed exegesis, we want to find out how has he adapted it, what might have been the source text for his adaptation.
Yeah.
And look at the Targums, that is the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew, to see if maybe Paul has chosen to preserve that tradition. But even if he has, we still need to ask, why has he worded it this way? Why has he gone with the Targum, which he usually doesn't, but sometimes his quotations do follow that. More than not, though, he's following the Septuagint wording. There's statistics that E. Earl Ellis, this I love him as a scholar, a great scholar. He runs down this kind of stuff. And we could look the percentages up on that in his book. Was it Paul in Scripture or something like that? But you can find that. So yeah, he's tweaking. When Paul is tweaking or following a translation that has tweaked the underlying Hebrew, or this changing the Septuagint, we have to pay attention to how he tweaked it. And usually there's some extra explicature or implicature of meaning that he's driving some point, that the choice, the alternations that he's made, the changes that he's made, are intentional and have interpretive force. And it's usually worth really paying attention to that nitty gritty and thinking through that. And I haven't done that work now. Yeah.
Why do you think here at this point he uses the phrase egraphe, the scripture? Why not just stick with Torah, onomos?
Yeah.
Like, why does he?
Yeah.
What does this say about his view of scripture, at least at the writing of Galatians, which may be our earliest or second earliest epistle of his? Like, what does this tell us about his view of scripture?
Well, I think it may say something more about the reference point that he has, as opposed to the reference point of his opponent, of his missionary rivals, or these opponents that he's engaging in this rhetorical thing. In other words, from their reference point, he's saying, listen to the law. That's your reference point. But Paul, his main reference point is Scripture. Scripture as a larger overarching principle and notion that is larger than law. For Paul wants to pay attention to the whole of Scripture, not just to the particulars of the law. So I'm not sure if people have argued this point, but I would like to argue this point, that that he's very deliberate about his use of descriptor word for parts of Scripture or whatever. So whenever you're choosing a word, or even a grammatical construction, and words are little grammatical constructions, you're choosing it for a construal. So what's being construed? So in verse 21, when he's calling out these opponents, or these people, those of you who want to be under the law, don't you listen to the law? He's speaking it from their reference point. construing it from their perspective of law orientation. But when Paul is speaking from his orientation, he is speaking it from the perspective of Scripture. What does Scripture say? So I think that's where I'd want to concentrate my my interpretation is that fine little distinction of reference point. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Now, verse 30b, like the second part of B, has ugar me. If you go to ugar me there, you can see that. At first, my first response was to take the u separate from the me, and u can introduce a. I want to take that as a question, and but of course, the punctuation shows a period there. You can look at the Step Bible there. But what if that were a question mark? Then you might have a question expecting a positive answer, but it would be in a negated sentence, which gets kind of gnarly how to translate. So it's not that, well, no, how do you put it? Basically, Paul would be wanting to affirm the son of the slave woman will not inherit with the son of the free woman, right?
Yeah,
That's
or
how I
will
translate,
he?
right?
Yeah, like.
Yeah. So in other words, yeah, this could be a question. I'm intrigued that the gar is splitting up the u and the may. Usually, gars, they kind of, if there's a unit that kind of belongs together, like a phrase or something, the gar will slide in after that. So the fact that the gar is splitting these makes me think that maybe the u and the may aren't working together, like as in emphatic negation. U may can work together in what's called an emphatic negation construction with the subjunctive mood. You can that means it's one of the strongest ways of denying something. Such and such will never happen. Such and such will
Yeah.
never ever happen. Now that's hard to translate, and translators don't often get that force in their translation. Now there's one way that you can ramp up that emphatic negation, and that is changing the subjunctive mood to the indicative mood, which is a modal increase in vividness, concreteness. And so that's just a little way that you could ramp it up. And here, that's what we see with the klero no mesi. That is, in fact, a future indicative, which people often understand that can be used as an equivalent to a subjunctive. I would maintain that actually you're increasing a vividness for a little bit of a prominence effect. So in either case, this is very strong denial, either simply because it's a future indicative, ume with a future indicative, or possibly that you have a question expecting a positive answer in regard to a negative depiction. Yeah, so either way, if it's a question expecting a positive answer with a negative proposition, that also is emphatic. So the main point is the son of the slave woman will not inherit with the son of the free one.
A couple of things that stick out to me. One, if should a period be replacing the comma after avtes, and in that case, would Paul be citing directly the passage from Genesis, like word for word? I say that because we have the gar there, which usually post positive, and makes me think maybe there should be a period there. But then by having the gar between the ume, does that in fact slow the reader or listener down and cause more of an emphatic, like this is unusual, therefore we're paying more attention to it kind of effect?
Ugarme.
Not that it never happens, but it's not the standard ume that you're talking about. Like, it's just
a little bit different.
So in that way, it could be more attention getting or more emphatic.
Yeah. Okay.
By doing something out of the ordinary.
So here's where it's really interesting. So here I looked at the Genesis 21:10 where this is from, and it's simply ugar kleronomesi.
Oh, so he keeps going. All right.
Well, no, I mean he there's no me there. It's not an ume
Right.
construction. So it's simply an u. So it makes me so he's intensifying the emphatic negation or somehow making it expecting a positive answer with a negative. Although you wouldn't normally have a with the future indicative.
It could be that the may is added to inflect it as a question.
Like well, that's what I'm saying is that may make it a question.
Yeah.
But the may is being added. So the may is added to the original quotation, and so we have to then account for that, or just in some way, why has that choice been made? And if Paul didn't make the choice, well, then why is he using a translation that also, that makes that choice? Yeah.
It would be like me saying, like, everybody knows John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten son. It'd be like me saying, like,
isn't it the case that God loved the world?
Yeah, exactly.
And so everyone say, well, yeah, that's a question expecting a positive answer. Isn't it that the son of the slave woman is not going to inherit with the free one? Well, yes, that's the case.
So why is he saying this? Why is he? I mean, we've been talking about Hagar and Sarah, and then the Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem below. Like, what is his point here? Why is he bringing Genesis into it right now and citing Genesis here? What's the slave woman and the free woman?
Well, Hagar and Sarah, and then Sarah represents a promise versus promise by the Spirit versus a fleshly way of obtaining something.
Mm-hmm.
And so Paul is drawing this analogy, and he says he's speaking allegorically, and so he's kind of acknowledging that what he's doing is a bit playful, but it's very powerful to connect certain ideas with one another. And so in this case, it seems like this might have been his end goal all along. Is the reason that he chose this analogy was because of this particular admonition to cast out the slave woman with her son. So if that was Paul's end point all along, was to get to this admonition, which, by the way, the laws, these correctives, would be saying we need to correct the situation, need to correct our understanding, and this is the correct behavior, is to really excommunicate people who aren't fitting the program. They're actually being disruptive of the program. They have a wrong understanding of the program, and really there's an excommunication that is really being called forth here, which today moderns we feel very uncomfortable with at times. We don't like confronting people and whatnot, and we have to remember that Paul is counter confronting them in a sense. They're the ones who wiggled their way in and pushed Paul out between. They wiggled their way in close to the Galatians, and to do that, they were saying bad things about Paul. Paul didn't have the whole gospel. He was withholding some things from them. He's a lone ranger. He's not really connected with the Jerusalem church. All these kinds of things we can surmise that probably was being said. So they started it. And so Paul has to re-inject himself in between them. And he's making these scriptural arguments. And now he's saying, you got to kick these people out. They need to go. And so, this happens today. People wiggle their ways into churches or into organizations, and they will disrupt it. And the appropriate response is to jettison, to kick them out.
Yeah.
So I think Paul has been planning this understanding that this is where the story goes, and to lead us to this point of exhortation that you need to cast out the slave woman and her son. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, the next verse 31 reads like this: Dio adelphou uk esmen pediskes techna alates eleftheras. So not a lot to comment on here as far as pronunciation goes. Just remembering that the Omicron Iota is a U kind of pronunciation. And really, that's all. Maybe that the delta is not a hard D, and kine it's a th sound, the o, and then we have adelphou, pediske. So we don't have like a hard D; it's more of like a smoother delta sound. But yeah.
All right. So here we have a dio as a conjunction. Dio is a conjunction that Levinson, Stephen Levinson, hopefully helps us with, that marks, see, how does he describe it? Typically introduces an expository or hortatory thesis that is inferred from what has already been stated. It contrasts with un in that dia does not move the argument on to a new point. So
Dio,
yeah. So dio is not advancing a new point. It's kind of restating what has been a thesis that is inferred. And in fact, if we look at the content of this verse, it's therefore, brothers, we are not of the children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. So there is, that's, he's already stated that in more than one way. And so the adelphi is, a vocative, direct address. And it's interesting, right at this point, he's co-identifying himself as a brother of theirs. So they are brothers in the same family. And so he's saying, I'm in the same boat as you, and we all belong to this family, and we're tekna of the eleftheras, the free woman. So there we see a proper uk Allah construction where, we're not one thing, but we're another. And that's typically what we would see. So yeah, this is the hortatory conclusion, which is really an identity statement. It's a statement with the verb imi, to be. So esmen, first plural, we are. And then you have a fronted genitive. So we are not. Tekna is the predicate nominative. We are not tekna. And then a genitive noun, pediskes, is fronted. But of the free woman. So yeah, that's quite a way to end by identity.
It's interesting. This just came to mind that in Galatians 3, there's a lot of focus on Abraham, and in Genesis 4, there's a lot of Galatians 4, there's a lot of focus on Sarah and Hagar, but especially Sarah. So it's really fascinating to think about how chapter 3 and then chapter 4 think about Abraham and then Sarah respectively. I'd never quite noticed that until just now. Do you understand my point?
Yeah. So it starts out with Abraham, but ends up with Sarah.
Yeah.
And then throughout the way, beginning of chapter 4, we have children mentioned, babies, inheritors, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's definitely a family kind of theme, and that this is something that you've been so helpful to have reflect on that. And adoption, although you don't think adoption is the right word.
No.
Verse chapter 5, I forget how you wanted to talk about adoption, establishing a son or as children. Can't remember your point on that.
Yeah, so I was just arguing that I'm a parent who's adopted like multiple children, and I'm an advocate for that, and used to hold a theology of adoption that kind of argued, well, we are adopted by God, but came to a place where, well, that doesn't make sense because we're already God's children. So why do we need to be adopted? Like, it doesn't make much sense to me. And so I read that word we often translate as adoption is like put in place or established or something like that. Sorry, my dog's getting ready to go crazy here. But yeah. So we can talk more about that when we come back to adoption. But yeah.
I'm looking at 4:5. I can't remember if we talked about this in Galatians 4:5. In order that we would receive the adoption, but the word there for receive is really receive back. It's apo lambano, tain weothosian. So
that's it. The phrase weothosian. That's the word we were talking about.
So to receive it back. So I think it's something that we lost actually. Something that we had and then we lost, and so we actually need to regain it back. But I don't know if that works in the logic of Greco-Roman culture. Apparently, like when you're adopted, you're like in.
Yeah.
But for sure, so once adopted, always adopted. Once, and people would apply that to once saved, always saved. I'm sure. I'm not sure that there's these analogies. They don't always. Analogies stand on three legs. You push them hard enough and they fall over. So there may be certain aspects to them where it's not completely analogous, which is the nature of analogies. They're not completely analogous. But, I think that brings us to the end of 4. I mean, is there anything else to say?
Do you have a parting shot for us?
I do. Paul Tournier, he's a great French psychologist, theologian. He says, in order to really understand, we need to listen, not reply. We need to listen long and attentively. In order to help anybody to open his heart, we have to give him time, asking only a few questions as carefully as possible in order to help him better explain his experience. And Paul was asking questions of these ones who want to be under the law. And so he's helping them try to listen to their needs. Actually, that I didn't mean to make that application, but it seems very apropos as we close out chapter 4. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Fred, for the insights. Thanks to you all for listening or watching and supporting the podcast. Please follow us on whatever platform you listen or watch. Subscribe to us, like, and even better, if you can reshare or share, that'd be great. Thanks again, and we hope this helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Galatia House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Galatia House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to GalatiaHouse.com today. Galatia House, language resources for the global community.